Maybe we started again, sorry.
I hope you can see me, hear me, or at least see my screen. Don't know if you can see me. Oh yeah.
Okay. Well,
hi. Yeah. So right, yeah, I'm coming at this as both a so-called poetry translation professional and a researcher. I say so-called because, well, is poetry translation a profession when I don't get paid for it, or when I maybe get paid £2 an hour for it, or whatever? I'll leave that for another day. Just to sort of start with what I said in the abstract, I'm sometimes asked what I do, and I say, oh yeah, I'm an academic, work at Newcastle University, and I'm a poetry translator. And people say, oh, translating poetry, that must be difficult. They don't say very much about working as an academic at Newcastle University. So there is this popular perception that poetry is a difficult thing to translate, even though, you know, I know from working from the marvelous colleagues I work with and everything like that, that say medical interpreting or political interpreting or translating law or whatever is also difficult in its way. Maybe the reason is that there is a strong popular knowledge that everybody knows that poems tell a story. And now the thing about poetry is that it goes deeper than other genres. It takes you further. It's emotionally engaging. But it does that to a great extent by the words and the language it uses. To quote the Serbian/French critic writing about a Serbian Bosnian poet, he said, this poet mines the deepest depths of language. And to my mind, that's what poetry does generally. It exploits the resources of the language that you're using to take you further than prose can. Of course, and this is something everybody knows, and that's why poetry translation has this idea of being difficult. Different languages have different resources. So, rhyme and alliteration is what most people know about. There's a sort of informal rule of English poetry, which is never rhyme, moon and June. Edgar Allan Poe did it back in the 19th century. At midnight in the month of June, I stand beneath the mystic moon. Right, okay. You're translating that into French, juin, lune. German, Juni, Mond. Okay, minuit, mois, you've got the alliteration of midnight and month. Mitternacht, Monat. Yeah, thanks to French, German, English being genetically related languages. But yeah, we go to Arabic, midnight, Nisaf al-Layl, month, Shahr, June, Junia, moon, al-Qamar. It's going to be problematic translating Edgar Allan Poe into Arabic. Into Chinese, well, June and moon, Liao Yue, Yue Liang. Okay, you've got a bit of a link there with Yue, the sort of moon character. But what about alliteration? The reason I put a couple of question marks on there is maybe we should also talk about the resources of the literary systems. I'm well assured that traditionally Chinese poetry doesn't use alliteration as a literary device much. Correct me if I'm wrong, put it in the chat. So that's another barrier to translation. Poets might also play with idioms. Idioms are notoriously hard to translate. So it's pearls before swine. It's something which you're doing something which somebody's really not going to appreciate. They don't have the intelligence or whatever to appreciate. Well, there is an expression in Chinese, for example, 对牛弹琴, but it has a different meaning. It means playing the zither to cows. So literally, there's a different meaning. So it's adding something, it's changing something in the poem. A Dutch idiom. De hand over het hart strijken. Stroking your hand over your heart. It means being lenient, being easygoing. Now, I know of no idiom, at least in English, to say that in a sort of physical way. Never mind, you don't say stroke your hand over your heart in English. You might say, well, have a heart to be merciful or be kind-hearted, but yeah. So we got a problem there if you're translating. So the differences between these resources gives the challenges of form. And I'll be discussing ways of solving that. I'll be building a lecture around a case study of my own translation. Did I say lecture? Sorry, session, because I'll be asking you for 5 minutes in the middle to have a go at translating or starting to translate a bit of poetry and share your experiences. So the case study, it's something I did as a Think Aloud study for an article that was published in Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian a few years ago. So on the handout, which I put the handout in the chat, I think there is a version of it if you read Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. Otherwise, here goes. So yeah, Think Aloud. I basically had an audio recorder going on the computer, on my phone, can't remember which, while I was translating. And I was just saying everything that came into my head while I was translating. And I also took photos of my drafts. So here you can see the first draft on the screen and the poem, lovely little poem by Ivan Lalic. I'm translating this poet's collected works, or actually finished translating. It's in at the publishers now. It's called Narancha, which means orange or orange tree. Zemlja I vatra I vazduh I voda u mestu ovog savršenog ploda traju za taj trenutak biti zreo. U studenome lišću sporo kruži zvezdani sistem. Jesen, biti cel. I show you my first draft. I always start with a sort of exploded literal English version, exploded in the sense that I give synonyms thrown up by the dictionary, because that's going to help me find the right words. So it goes, earth and fire and air and water, in the flesh of this perfect fruit, last or endure that moment or instant, being mature or ripe. In the cold or ice cold, leaves slowly, sluggishly, leisurely, unhurriedly, circles, orbits, wheels, goes round, etc. A stellar system or a star system. Autumn. I put in 4 in case, okay, the American, in case I might need it. Being full, being entire, literally being whole. So yeah, a lovely poem about an orange or an orange tree. To tell you the truth, what I've shown you here on screen and what I wrote down is my actual second read through the poem, which is when I make this literal first draft. My first one, I go through the form. I just read it. What's going on formally? So it's an 11-syllable line. Every line has 11 syllables. Zemlya I, 1, 2, 3, Vatra I, 4, 5, 6, Vazduch I, 7, 8, 9, Voda, 10, 11. If any of you know Italian or Spanish, that'd be a very familiar line to you. There's alliteration, Vatra I, Vazduch I, Voda, in the first line. Line 3, Traju za taj trenutak. Something also worth noting is earth and fire and air and water are the medieval 4 elements that in medieval science make up everything in the universe. So that's actually something where there are no synonyms. I couldn't say sky instead of water, instead of air, for example. I couldn't write that. So, challenges. Let's look at what more closely at what challenges this throws up. To start with, the syllabic rhythm. We don't have syllabic rhythms in English. At a guess, most literary cultures use syllabic rhythms in poetry. Zemlya I, vatra I, vazduch I, voda, umysł, owoc, završeno, ploda. Chinese, traditional Chinese, loves syllabic rhythms. Yuje shengbailu, yujo qin luowa. Excuse my pronunciation, please. First 2 lines of a lovely poem by Li Bai, the Tang Dynasty poet. Yeah, di di, di 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 di. A sort of 2-3 rhythm. And well, other things going on as well, like parallelism between the 2 lines. But parallelism will actually be a problem I might have to solve. End of line 3, biti zreo, being mature. End of the final line, biti tseo, being whole, full. Yeah. English doesn't do that. English does syllable. Sorry, does accentual, the beats. To be or not to be, that is the question. 5-beat line, iambic pentameter. A 7-beat line, I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely seas and the sky. Sorry, lonely sea. And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. 7 stresses, but no regular syllables. So to translate, you're going to have to make a decision there. What strategies have you got? Here, I'd like to quote James Holmes. So 1988, from really notes that his students made of lectures in the late 70s, early 80s, founding father of translation studies and a great Dutch to English poetry translator. And I had the honor to have him as a sort of mentor when I was a young poetry translator. He said, there are various things you can do. Mimetic, you can imitate the source form. So put in an 11-syllable line in English. Analogical, think of a target language form which has a similar function. Iambic pentameter maybe in English. Organic is allow the semantic material to prompt the form. In other words, just whatever fits the words best. If you've got 7 ideas in a line, well, maybe that's going to be a 7-beat line. Or maybe. What it doesn't mention is abandoning, which from my own research, I've found out that that's a very common thing to do, is simply, okay, let's go for free verse. We won't have a rhythm at all, or we won't have rhyme at all, because this could also apply to rhyme. Right. Let's go on to rhyme. We've got rhymes. Voda, ploda. Zdreo, tseo. Right. This is where things get tricky. And I guess about half the translators into English say, oof, too tricky, not going to do that, or for various reasons. About half the translators into English say, okay, give it a go. Let's start with the reasons against, and then I'll come to the reasons for going for rhyme. Firstly, it's unfashionable in English poetry these days. It's been relegated to almost to the field of comic verse, perhaps. Now, there are serious poets who write using strict rhyme and rhythm, but it's, shall we say, it's a special technique rather than a default technique. So maybe that's a reason for abandoning rhyme in a poem like this. Another reason is it's hard work for the translator. You've got to find rhymes, difficult, as I mentioned. Your target language doesn't necessarily rhyme with the same words. Also, the modern day norm of poetry translation is you've got to stay pretty loyal to what the poet writes. You can't go off on a tangent of your own. Well, if you can, but then you won't call it a translation. You call it a version or inspired by or whatever. In previous centuries, yeah, sure, that was fine. So yeah, in lines 1 and 2, I probably have to find rhymes with earth and fire and air and water, which means which have something to do with flesh, perfect, fruit, last, moment. Probably not mature, because that's got to rhyme with full or whole in the last line. Yeah, right. That's one constraint. Another one is, back in the 19th century, when rhyme in English was the norm, you could bend the grammar to make your lines rhyme. So if you want to have something about, I went into the garden, you could say, when into the garden I did go, and the birds were singing soft and slow. You're not allowed to do that in modern poetry. It sounds dreadfully old-fashioned. You've got to write when I went into the garden. The birds were singing soft and I don't know. So as a result, many translators urge abandoning, and some scholars as well. Lefebvre back in the 70s, translating poetry, was saying, don't do rhyme. It's a waste of time. It's awful. Okay. Some people say, yeah, you've got to translate it. Rhyme might be a deliberate choice by the poet. So here, Ivan V. Lalic, most of this 1968 collection is in free verse. But for this poem, he decided to use rhyme. So there's a poetic meaning in here. Maybe he's wanting to make a zvezdany system, a stellar system, a star system that revolves, just like the oranges revolve in the stellar system or the star system of the orange tree. By the way, I had to Google star system. A star system is when you've got a binary or even 3 stars which are circling each other in a star system. It's 3 stars. Sorry, I'm thinking totally off at a tangent. There's a famous Chinese sci-fi novel about the star system. Anyway, sorry. The problem. of working out what the stuff. I can't remember the name, so forget it. Why do it? Yeah, deliberate topic, or it might be marking the genre in some way. So a classic sonnet, you'd expect it to have 14 lines, rhythm and rhyme. So there might be an obligation to rhyme for those reasons. But you have these constraints that I mentioned. Well, one way out is creativity. Norms of poetry translation, the agreed rules of the genre, say you're allowed to be creative in poetry translation, where you're not allowed to be creative in political interpreting or legal translation, for example. You'd soon lose your job in that way. So creativity. Creativity here, I'm going to define it. So using a cognitive approach to creativity, used by creativity scholars really. So take a problem. How do you take your pet to the vet? A creative solution to that problem, it would have to be novel, in other words, new, but also appropriate, fit for purpose. So walking your pet, walking your dog on the lead to the vet would be appropriate, but it's not novel. It's pretty ordinary, so it's not creative. Getting a dog to drive would certainly be novel, new, but not appropriate, as I'm sure you'd agree. However, put your bag in the basket of your recumbent bike that you normally use for shopping. I'd say that's creative because it's new and it's appropriate. So that gives us leeway with these restrictions I was talking about. Use a slide here I use in my MA slides, just like the one before actually. Here's a prize-winning translation of a Dutch poem. J.C. Bloom, back in the, I don't know, 1930s, 1940s, writing a sonnet, fixed form, about the ordinariness of the Dutch landscape and the experience. And so the first verse is building up the ordinariness. And yeah, sure, in verse 3, something extraordinary happens. You've got the literal there. I'll read you the source. Natuur is voor tevredenen of legen. En dan, wat is natuur nog in dit land? Een stukje bos, de grootte van een krant. Een heuvel met wat villages ertegen. Right, iambic pentameter. Natuur is voor tevredenen of legen. Badum, 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 badum. Legen ertegen, land en krant. Perfect rhymes in Dutch. Judith Wilkinson's prize-winning translation said, nature is for the satisfied or hollow. You see from the literal, yes, empty to hollow, deviating slightly. And what does it add up to in this land? A patch of wood, some ripples in the sand, a modest hill where modest villas follow. So what's she done? There are two types of creative change there. I'd call them adjustments. So she's changed legen, empty people, to hollow, slight change. Ertegen, against it, to follow. Yeah, slight change maybe, but a major change, I call this a transformation. De grootte van een krant, the size of a newspaper has become some ripples in the sand. That is going a long way. The judges loved it. They gave it first prize. To my mind, that's creative. It's definitely novel. It's different than the source text. It's appropriate because it's describing the Dutch landscape, which is what he's doing. The Netherlands is surrounded by beaches with ripples in the sand. So it's a sort of, it's a Dutch image, if you like. I find I mentioned about half the translators abandon rhyme and rhythm, and half of them keep it. Here's a poem start again of a formal sonnet by a poet called Giuseppe Belli, Italian poet writing in the dialect of working class Rome in the 1830s, writing mainly comic verses in a colloquial working class dialect. Thousands of poems, they're lovely. I did a study where I found that 11 translators have tried to tackle it. And in fact, when I researched this lecture, I found a 12th. So this is on Judgment Day. I cannot speak Roman dialect, so I won't try to read it. The first translation abandons rhyme and rhythm. 4 big angels with trumpets will stand, one in each corner, playing, then in a loud voice, they will start calling, "Who's next?" Mike Stocks has a more colloquial, but also rhymed and rhythmed version. 4 portly angels, trumpets raised up high, will plonk down in the corners at their ease and blow their horns, and with a booming cry will start to state their business. "Next up, please." In the study, I found about half, these are the numbers of translation output. So the numbers of translation texts I found. About half recreate the rhyme and rhythm. So 6 recreate the rhythm, 5 recreate the rhyme. 2 or 3 abandon and go to free verse. And there's also a sort of mixed category where they have a bit of form, but not completely. One very interesting thing I found is those translators who tried to recreate the form, tended also to try to recreate the colloquialism or even the regionalism. So here's a poem in Robert Garriach, writing in Edinburgh dialect. So colloquial Edinburgh version of the Scots language. So Scots being a sister language of English. 4 muckle angels, I cannot read Scots. I read Scots like a Yorkshireman. I'll give it a go. 4 muckle angels with a trumpet stalking till the forarts shall open the inspection. They'll give a blow and ball to his section in their huge voices. "Come our yees be walking." So the willingness to recreate poetic form seems to be recreated to a willingness to try to recreate the whole poetic texture of what's going on. So back to a problem poem. Zemla I vatra I vazduh I voda, umesa ovog savršenog ploda. Literally, the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, this is the Serbian variety, doesn't have articles, so I've added in other. What would you do with your favorite target language? What would you do with this problematic first 2 lines? How might you tackle it? Would you keep rhyme or abandon it? If you're using rhyme, what rhyme words would come to mind? I've given line 3 because you might want to swap around last, endure for that moment or instant. It's okay to swap elements around. You might even want to bring mature, ripe into the mixture. Have a bit of fun. On the handout, I've given various apps, rhyming apps. You know, take about 5 minutes. If there's somebody near you, now I know this is only for people in the room, who has the same target language as you, same favorite language, then you can chat about it together.
I will resend on the chat. Some people didn't have it. Oh, quite a few. So for those of you, we can ask them to chat here, or what would you prefer? And just say they can send their comments here.
So hopefully you can see the text now. Sorry, I should have put it on the handout. Sorry. Basically, the idea is in about 5 minutes or so, any comments you want to put in the chat? How easy, difficult was it? What sort of ideas were you playing with? I do not expect a perfect version. Took me a lot longer than this to make an imperfect version. Okay, any thoughts, observations, ideas you're playing with? Even finished, even draft lines? In your favorite target language, if it's written in a non-European script, sorry, yeah, if it's written in a non-European script, I might have you to transcribe it into pinyin or, yeah, with Arabic, I'm very, very slow. Yeah, so anything in the chat? People in the room, anything? What thoughts are you coming up with?
Yeah, when you rhyme it, what happens sometimes it becomes a bit dum-dum-dum-dum-dum.
Yeah, so
sol och jord och vind och frukt mognar här och biter frukt. Luft och vatten, sol och mull mognar och gör frukten full.
sounds super. That would you want to come and say it? Would you want to say come and say it into the come and say it into the microphone? Sounds brilliant.
Well, also, that's a way to, or this is what it's two variants in Swedish. Sol och jord och vind och fukt mognar här och blir till frukt. Eller, or alternative, luft och vatten, sol och mull mognar och gör frukten full.
Hey.
But what happens is that you have to then not have water, air and water. So you change water into damp, fukt.
Oh,
And then you can rhyme on fruit.
Yeah.
And that's a way of cheating, isn't it? To have synonyms. And it
creative,
doesn't, right.
creativity.
You just...
So Hazel Hyman is saying, change the order of the 4 elements to aid rhyme with the second line. But didn't quite get there. Sorry, possibly earth and, yeah, absolutely. So I was playing around with changing the order in English because there are the 4 elements, but they don't have to be in any particular order. And yeah, it took me a lot longer than 5 minutes to get to a rhyme pair. I generally reckon half an hour per rhyme pair. What about Chinese in the room? Have you got anything you'd like to, any observations you're making?
Well, I would say we call this image 意象 in Chinese. It's kind of nouns, kind of like a various of nouns just combine together to make kind of feeling. Yeah, but I haven't think about how to organize such images. We call 意象, like nouns. Yeah, it's quite difficult.
Would you want to say that into the mic? Or?
Oh, well, this is amateur idea.
So is that 意象 or 意象?
Like nouns, different nouns like earth, fire, water.
So a sequence of nouns.
Yeah. We call 意象 in Chinese.
So yeah, so you're looking at the form of this 意象, is it?
The syllabus, I would say.
Right. Yeah. As I
organizing images.
Yeah.
Would you do that instead of and rhyme? Instead of
so
sound?
organizing
Yeah,
the.
not sound,
but yeah.
Yeah.
So putting an organization on the images. I'm just relaying this to the people on Zoom. Right, we've got a Russian here. Excuse my, I read Russian like Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. Земля и пламя, воздух и вода, соединился в сочности плода. Perfect. Ah, yeah, but of course, voda, ploda. it's super if you've got a cognate language. So the words for water and fruit are very similar between Russian and Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. I have that advantage when I translate from Dutch. Quite a famous Dutch poem talks about rowers groeien en roeien in het landschap, growing and rowing into the landscape. Groeien, growing, roeien, rowing. Yeah, brilliant. Closely related languages. So that can help, definitely. Hope you enjoyed that bit of fun. Yeah, I think, and in the end, I do poetry translation for fun because it's not there for the money. Well, okay, it's not just for fun. There's also an intellectual excitement in it. And there's also an excitement in getting wonderful poetry out there to more readers than those of the original language. So there are lots of pluses there. So does your poem come out, question for the Chinese translator, does your poem come out with a feeling of an absent fifth element? Would you want to read that into the mic, the Chinese version?
Okay. I think the Chinese, that's called, yeah, that's to a kind of parallel structure. That's 大地火焰雨水气. That's called the 大地 is the earth, 火焰 is the fire, 水气 水 is the water, and air is the qi. And 融入果肉真神奇 is kind of 果肉 is a fruit. I think he's kind of translate perfect fruit, and 真神奇 is amazing, kind of a feeling to kind of make the structure balanced with the first syllabus. I think so. Yeah.
Sounds great. With Arabic, I studied Arabic so long ago that I couldn't really. Could you read, Catherine?
We can unmute, ask
great.
Catherine to unmute. So that would be the participants. Catherine, if you don't mind, we ask you to unmute.
With a
Catherine,
K.
this one. Ask to unmute.
Hello.
Catherine, would you mind? Yes, hi.
Hi. I'm not a native speaker, so I just made a wild stab, quite literal. And it says, الأرض النار الماء الهواء في لحم هذا التمر التام يدوم للحظة تلك. And I did two things. I eliminated all the ands between the first four words, and I changed fruit to tamar, which is date, because it rhymes with tamar, perfect fruit, tamar tam. So that was just for fun.
Lovely.
Arab would be horrified, but that was my best attempt.
Lovely. Got some other messages there. So yeah, thanks very much. I'd like to say now, well, what did I do? Well, to start with, I spent a long time on it. Recording time was 68 minutes over 2 sessions. And getting the literal down was probably the first 15 minutes of that. And there you can see my rhyme jottings, thanks to Rhyme Zone, rhyming dictionaries, brainstorming. So there's a lot of brainstorming there. And oh yes, you can see at the bottom of the page my notes about Zvezdany system. And that's how my nice, neat first draft started looking. And after about a good hour and a half, I came up with the water, earth, and fire and air. In this fruit's perfect flesh, last there, for that right moment to be sweet. And then sweet would rhyme with to be complete at the end. Right. By the time I came to write it up on the computer, I felt that to be sweet was being too creative. So I got the water, earth, the fire and air lasts for a moment's ripeness when they bear flesh in this perfect fruit to be full grown. And then to be its own, revolving slowly through cold leaves, a star system. One note I've made on there is 4 meter. So quick note that I've converted it to a tetrameter, a 4-beat line. I'm using the, what is James Holmes's? Is it analogical, I think? No, it's organic, what fits best. I sent the manuscript off to the publishers, collected works of Ivan Vilanich, and it sat there for a while, and I asked what was happening. They said, oh yes, we're going to schedule it for the year after next. So I said, can I revise it? And they said, oh yes, revise all you like. I wasn't happy, so I changed it. This bititseo is nagging at me. So I've changed it. I've also changed it to iambic pentameter, the water and the earth, the fire and air. Within this perfect fruit, last till they bear flesh. I looked at this for this lecture and it's still nagging at me. That bititseo. I might go back. It still hasn't been published. So I might go back to sweet and complete. Anyway, that's why draft 23 question mark. I've no idea how many drafts these things take. I'll skip that because we're a bit short of time. Just finally, a collaborative translation project that I've been working on, involving Dutch and English, or sorry, Dutch and UK poets writing English, UK poets writing English and Scots, where the source poet is there in the room, the target poet responsible for the target draft, and there's an in-betweeny bilingual expert. They're all translators, so we didn't want to call them the translator, though they're translators with a knowledge of poetry. You can see that's me a couple of years back. Is the sort of go-between, because the target poet doesn't write Dutch. Bilingual resource interpreter might be helping the target poet brainstorm and has to sit on their hands because it's the target poet's job to come up with the target version. They're the assistant. What happened? Well, to start with, there were 2 poets to 1 non-poet there. I'm not a poet, for instance. They spent a long time talking about form. So a lovely poem here by one of the source poets, her anonymized name is Lauren. Her group spent an hour talking about, is this formal verse? the language advisor had written a bilingual crib, aid in English, and put free verse. And the poet said, hey, wait a minute, no, it's not free verse. It's got a 2-beat rhythm to it. And they spent an hour arguing. No, sorry, not arguing. They were discussing it in a very friendly and interesting way. So, and afterwards, the target poet said, I'm not sure, I think it's free verse, actually, in an interview afterwards. But anyway, what we found out was the approach tended to depend on how the target poet writes. So if the target poet writes a sort of slightly formal verse in the source language would have a similar touch of form to it in the target language. If the target poet wrote free verse, then a more formal verse would become free verse in the target language. So, interestingly, translators in interviews, sorry, not everybody's a translator. The language advisors, being professional translators in interviews, were the ones who said, hey, actually, folks, we should be creative here, which is maybe because they've got more experience of having to make creative solutions to intractable problems. Okay, hope you found it interesting. And right, thank you very much.
It was a fascinating talk. It's so interesting. Thank you
Sorry,
so
sorry, I
much.
went over slightly.
No, it's not at all. It was our side with a bit of technical issue as well. Thank you very much, Francis. So we probably will have time just for 1 or 2 questions. So if anyone have any questions, you're more than welcome to put up your hands. Then I will ask you to unmute yourself. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, thank you, Hazel, for your comments.
Yeah, great. That's great to hear, Hazel.
Yes. And also Yan Yu said, thank you, Francis.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? We have lots of comments. Will the whole talk be available to watch again? Yes, it will be available via Zoom. Oh, via YouTube. I'll let you know when it's finally published. You do have a so was that Vera Wang? Yes, I will go to you. I will give you the right to Vera Wang. Okay, well, so am I passing it? Where is Vera Wang? Can't find you. Is it? No, as long as I ask you that, then it's not working. Chen, is it possible for you to unmute Vera Wang? I didn't see her, did you?
All right, hold on for a second.
Yeah,
Sorry.
couldn't find her there. I don't know.
Whose name again? Sorry.
Yeah, maybe she's.
Maybe she's not here. I don't know.
Oh,
Vera Wang, could you
yes.
raise your hand?
Yes.
Sorry, could you raise your hand, please?
Okay, that's.
Could you raise your hand through the...
Yes, now I have also asked. I've asked you to unmute now. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful speech, Francis. And thank you so much for Saihong to organize it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. And then I'm at the moment in Aberystwyth, and then I'm a poet by myself in Chinese, and I always feel interested in translating poems, poetry. And in China, there are disputes between whether poetry can be translatable or not? And what's your view? I really want to know that answer. Of course, because you are doing that, and I think your answer should be yes, but there must be something, you know, and there might be some factors and untranslatable or translatable. And then would you like to distinguish those? And this is my first question. Another question is that when I read English text without, if were it not me, I mean, when I read some novels embedded some Chinese ancient classic translations of the Chinese poems, I myself, although I'm knowledgeable to, in certain way knowledgeable to Chinese poems, classical poems, but I still feel at a loss about what is the original poetry, and what is all still need to spend quite a lot of time to search the original version. And what's your view about that, please? The creativity, I know creativity may sometimes, or translation itself has transformed or changed too much. Even the native speakers cannot identify the original piece. This is my second question. Thank you so much.
Right, thanks very much for those questions. The first one, yeah, very interesting. Is anything untranslatable? I'd say nearly everything is translatable. I think maybe, you know, perhaps the same for all genres. If you allow yourself creativity, sure, we come up against phrases that are, we feel we can't do justice to in some way or others. So we're finding workarounds, we're maybe trying to lose an effect here, add an effect there. One of Ivan V. Lalich's poems, it was a very early poem, it's called Kishaolishchu, and it means rain in the leaves. Every single line sounds like Kishaolishchu. It sounds like rain in the leaves. Any English translation, rain doesn't sound like rain, whereas Kisha sounds like rain and Lishchu sounds like rain in the leaves. And there were 20 lines of this. My only solution was to give the source text on the left with a guide on how to pronounce the letters sh, ch, ch, and a literal English translation on the right. I think there I would say safely that's an untranslatable poem, at least into English. But you know, that's really, I'd say an exception. But some are really tough, sure, take a long while. I've got a question here. How did you record your thinking process of translating? For what purpose? I basically was just switch the PC on and switch the voice recorder on. And the idea was to really just analyze my processes of translating.
Well, thank you so much for Francis, for all the questions, and everybody as well for all the questions. Could you name the poet again for the rain in the leaves, please?
It's Ivan V. Lalich. So it's the same poet as for Orange.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Francis, for your wonderful talk. And also thank you very much for the audience for your messages and also for your questions. Thanks again, Francis. It's been a great honor to have you here. Given the time we have, so we will need to move on. So we'll have 5 minutes break. So we get ready for Johan's talk. Thank you so much, Joe.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you so much for
audience.
that. Yes, we got lots of applause for you. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody here.